skończę
Dobrze.
no i dom.
Dobra. Dobra.
No już sobie będzie
I działamy.
Dobra.
Czekamy na Macieja. Czekamy na Macieja.
Bartosz Węglarczyk to szef.
Tak, to jest pewnie tak.
Pozdrów go.
Przekażę pozdrowienia, oczywiście.
Okay, good morning everyone. This room from this side is a little bit bigger than from the other side. Good morning, thank you for coming. My name is Maciej Turek, I'm with the Faculty of Institute of American Studies and Polish Diaspora. And it's my pleasure to welcome you at this meeting within the series that's called Transatlantic Encounters, jointly organized by the Faculty of International Political Studies, Institute of American Studies and Polish Diaspora, and Transatlantic Studies program that I happen to run for some time. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you guests of the faculty, Ambassador Daniel Fried and Kamil Turecki. And just a brief introduction of both gentlemen. Ambassador Daniel Fried is currently Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Between 1977 and 2017, he worked for the U.S. Department of State, holding a variety of diplomatic positions in, among others, St. Petersburg, Belgrade, and Warsaw, where he served as ambassador to Poland from 1997 to 2000. He also served as a special assistant and National Security Council senior director for Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, and Assistant Secretary for Europe from 2005 to 2009, and since February 2012, Ambassador Fried has been teaching a class here at the faculty devoted to transatlantic diplomacy after 1989. And Kamil Turecki is international affairs journalist with Onet PL, but also a graduate of the Institute of American Studies and Polish diaspora. He recently authored a book, Przerwane milczenie na gruzach World Trade Center, for which he received Maciej Parzyński Award for Media and Journalist Service to Polish diaspora. And from this place, I would like to thank very much to both gentlemen to agree to be with us today. And I also appreciate the Jagiellonian University Excellence Initiative and one of its framework, Society of the Future, which made possible to appoint Ambassador Daniel Fried as a visiting professor here at the faculty. And also my great thanks go to the faculty itself and the Institute of American Studies and Polish and Diaspora. And just a final note, a brief note about the format of the meeting. Ambassador Fried and Kamil Turecki will be speaking for about 45 minutes. And then we'll have about half an hour for a Q&A session. So if anyone would have a question, please just raise your hand, introduce yourself, and go ahead with the question. And just a request, please make sure it's a question, not a statement, not a comment. But a question, I think we would very much appreciate it. So I'm just going to pass the mic to the table, and gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me. At the very beginning, Mr. Ambassador, do you believe in Western countries' solidarity concerning what's happening right now in Ukraine?
So, I have in mind Madeleine Albright's famous statement, because I knew her pretty well. I'm an optimist, she said, but I worry a lot.
Now, what do you mean by this?
The West has done pretty well in support of Ukraine. We've done a lot better than Putin expected. We've mounted strong sanctions, though we need to do more, and the Americans, the British, the Poles, and others have organized a major military logistics operations to get weapons in the hands of the Ukrainians. This is pretty good.
But
I always worry. Run hard, run scared. Only the paranoid survive, so you have to watch out for the cracks, the fissures in the West. Don't take anything for granted, and keep pushing. That doesn't mean be confrontational. Now, the Germans are going through whatever they're going through now, realizing that their previous policy toward Russia was based on, let us say, illusions and a measure of, let us say, narrow national interest. But help bring them along. We may face very difficult choices in the future with respect to Ukraine. The Ukrainians may succeed on the battlefield. This is possible. They have done much better than anybody, including the Americans, expected. Their victory is possible. They may stop the Russians. They may turn them back. But they may not. We don't know. Right now, we have to concentrate on giving the Ukrainians all the weapons we can and on pushing the Russians through as many sanctions as we can manage to organize ourselves around.
But Mr. Ambassador, how shall we do that, especially when we have, for example, President Erdogan in Turkey, we've got Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Well, that's not surprising. We've got President of Croatia, Zoran Milanovic, and so on and so on. That's why I'm asking about the solidarity of Western countries.
So there are various problems, but let's break that down. First of all, the president of Croatia doesn't have any power at all.
That's
So
true.
he can say what he wants. That's not the government. Erdogan is taking a very tough position with respect to Finnish and Swedish accession to NATO. But it isn't so bad with respect to support for Ukraine, and Erdogan can't block European Union sanctions, nor can he block military assistance to Ukraine. Now, Viktor Orban is another matter. He's not good on these issues.
The micro a bit.
He's not good. Orban is not good on these issues. He is sympathetic to Putin on ideological grounds. He looks at Ukraine through a narrow Hungarian national perspective. It is almost the opposite of Poland's policy, which is not narrow at all. It is broad and strategic. So Orban is a problem. But there are ways to work around this. I wasn't 40 years a diplomat for nothing. Let's take a concrete example, an example right now. So the European Commission has proposed a series of measures to cut back on European purchases of Russian oil, and oil is Russia's #1 exporter. So if you want to hit Putin's cash flow, you have to go after oil. Gas is a little harder. Oil is possible. Orban, and it's not just Hungary, a number of European countries are holding up a consensus. Well, it used to be the job of people like me in government, in the US government, to figure out a way around this. And we need to do that. Either the European Union has to come up with another way other than an embargo of curtailing and reducing Russian cash flows from sales of oil, and or the Americans can back up the European Union with secondary sanctions. The Europeans, particularly the West Europeans, particularly the French, hate secondary sanctions. But I can handle that. There are things the Americans can do to support what the European Commission was trying to do, or some other means, to make sure that Putin doesn't get the cash flow he needs. You mentioned a bunch of obstacles. You're right. There are obstacles. It's the job of people in government to figure out a way around it.
Yeah, you said there are a few things to do, especially by the Americans.
Yep.
What do you mean by this?
Well, for example, on the issue of oil.
Yes.
So the European Union has proposed basically an embargo, going to zero. But the purpose, remember what it is they're trying to achieve. They're trying to do the right thing, which is take money out of Putin's war machine. There are different ways to do that. You don't need an embargo necessarily. You could have a tariff on Russian oil, which means that the Russians would in effect receive less per barrel of oil they sold to Europe. Or you could have a price cap. In other words, if the world price of oil is $100 a barrel, the European Union could say, we're only going to pay $50 a barrel. Now, Putin might say, well, I won't sell it to you at that price, at which point the European Union could say, no, пожалуйста, proszę bardzo, because the Russians do not have the ability to send that oil to other places. So if they don't sell it to Europe, they don't sell it at all, and they don't have the money. All of this gets very tricky. We don't know what Putin would do. But now this is what the European Union could announce a price cap on oil, but the Americans could back that up. We could say that we will sanction any other country in the world like China or India that purchases oil at full market price, but we will waive the sanctions if they purchase the oil at the price cap the European Union is putting on. This might work. And of course, if the European Union is hopelessly deadlocked, the Americans could do it unilaterally.
And now we are smiling to Germans or French.
No, the German government is actually thinking pretty good. They support the embargo.
Right now, but a few months ago, well,
The German government, remember, the German government is a coalition. The energy ministry is in the hands of the Greens. The Green Party is very tough on Putin. They always have been. They're pretty solid on this issue. Now, you can make an argument that an oil embargo isn't the best option. You should go for a price cap. I can argue either way. The point is to take money out of Putin's pocket right now. Come up with a decision, drive it through. Now, I've gone into detail about oil, the oil issue, because this is actually what the policymakers are working on, like, right now. And the issues are serious. There's a risk when you go after Russian energy exports. There is a risk, but you have to weigh that risk against the reality of an actual war in Ukraine. And our tolerance for risk needs to go up when there's a war, because our interests will suffer if Putin wins this war. Of course, Poles understand this perfectly well. The Germans are divided. They are wrestling with this issue.
yeah, also because of their nostalgic attitude towards Russia.
Well, look, German attitudes toward Russia are complicated. We could have a whole discussion about that. I will put it this way.
But it was visible at the very beginning of the war.
Yes, but the Germans supported our sanctions against the Russians. I was the chief sanctions
At
negotiator.
last.
No. They supported it early on. Look, I was the chief U.S. negotiator on sanctions, and I worked with the Germans, and every handshake deal I made with the Germans, they kept. Now, you could tell me about Gerhard Schroeder, and I would agree with you. And you could tell me about the history and the cultural memory of Rapallo, and I would agree with you. And you could tell me about the fatuous part of the Social Democratic Party in Germany that seems to feel guilty about World War II, but that guilt only extends to Moscow, not to Kyiv or Warsaw. Like, I get it. I am not blind to the problems the Germans have. However, the Greens are doing a good job. there are a lot of people in the German foreign policy establishment who are heartily sick of their previous position and understand that they've got to change it. I want, in foreign policy, I generally tend to look for converts rather than heretics. I'm interested in helping the Germans improve their policy rather than yelling at them for their past mistakes. Besides, I'm an American. I've worked in American governments. I know a lot about mistakes in policy, okay? I know a lot about that. So the fact is, a country which is attempting to lead in foreign policy is going to make mistakes.
And what about Mr. Erdogan?
Well, he seems to have drawn a line, or he seems to be pushing hard against the Finns, and I suspect especially the Swedes. And there's a question in my mind what he is after. Is he after some Swedish commitment about the PKK? Is he trying to play a complicated game to get something out of the United States? I just don't know.
And PKK is Kurdistan Workers' Party, right?
Yeah, the PKK is a terrorist group. They're a separatist group within Turkey. They have been the Turks have been fighting them for a long time. This is not a simple issue. I think there was a lot of anger at the Turkish position because the Turks had previously promised the Finns and Swedes that they would support their NATO membership, their accession to NATO. Erdogan changed his mind. I'm pretty sure the Biden administration was mad about that. And right now they're trying to work out some deal, and they're probably wise to do it not in public.
Yeah, but what kind of deal? What's simply saying what kind of deal President Erdogan would like to achieve?
I don't know. I don't think anybody.
Project F-35?
Maybe. Look, I don't know. You're asking the right questions. I don't have the answers. But if I were...
But you have your opinion.
Yeah, but...
And you can share it with us.
If I knew... Look, I believe in a free press. You can ask any question you want. That's okay. I don't have to answer. Besides, in this case, to be honest, I really don't know. I haven't been to Turkey in a number of years. I'm not current on the current... I'm not happily, I'm not current, so I can't give away something. I don't know, is the honest answer, what Erdogan is after. I do know that in the end, Finland and Sweden are going to be part of the Western security family, one way or another. And we will find a way to make that happen.
And what will it change in terms of geopolitics, in terms of security and so on?
It means that Putin has alienated European countries that would otherwise have been willing to work with him. And that in his war against Ukraine, if we succeed in helping the Ukrainians turn him back, could be a massive blow to Putinism. Now, in Russian history, unsuccessful Russian wars often lead to domestic upheaval or domestic reforms. One of the myths of Russian history is that the Russian people have an infinite capacity for suffering. Well, they did in World War II, at least after June 1941. And in the War of 1812, we tend to look at that war through the prism of Lev Tolstoy's War and Peace. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but we all look at it through War and Peace. But we forget the wars that Russia lost. The Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War, and World War I. They lost. And in two of those cases, there was revolution, and in one of those cases, there was reform. The Russians lost the war in Afghanistan, and when that was one of the precipitating factors in Gorbachev trying to reform the Soviet Union, which failed. But we forget how far Gorbachev got in trying to make his country an honest, decent country, which turned out to be impossible. You couldn't reform the Soviet Union, and he tried. But you see where I'm headed with this. Putin has taken an enormous risk. There is something, if you listen to Russian official propaganda, there is something hysterical about it. They've gone, at least if you watch Russian television, completely fascist. Bloodthirsty, violent rhetoric. That strikes me as the hysteria of someone who is deeply insecure. They're exposed. If you're a Russian and you've failed to conquer Ukraine, you have to wonder. I mean, think about it. 3 months ago, 4 months ago, if anybody told you that the Russians are going to attack Ukraine and we don't know if they will win, you would have thought, oh, come on. The Russians will beat the Ukrainians. And after all, in 2014, in the summer of 2014, when the Russian regular forces came in, they made short work of the Ukrainians at Ilovaisk. The Ukrainians were badly hit. The Russians won. And so the American administration, the Biden administration, but I think even the Polish government assumed that the Russians had learned their mistakes and they reformed their military, and the Americans basically predicted, the American government basically predicted that the Russians would be in Kyiv within 72 hours. And that was just dead wrong. I mean, we got that one wrong. We were right about Putin's intentions. The Biden administration in early November concluded that Putin intended to attack Ukraine. I remember, because a friend of mine from the National Security Council staff called me up and in a nervous voice said we had to meet for coffee. So we meet, and he tells me that they had sent Bill Burns to Moscow, and his mission, it wasn't clear why. They had sent him to warn the Russians not to attack Ukraine. And Bill Burns had come back and said, this is bad, the Russians are going to attack. The Biden administration was certain that Russia would attack. They were right, unfortunately. Fortunately, they were wrong about the military outcome. They thought Putin would win. And they got that wrong, and it took them a few weeks to realize that Ukraine could actually succeed. And that's when you started to see the American military assistance for Ukraine ramping up. I also think that Biden's trip to Poland made a difference in his thinking, because he went to the border, he saw the Ukrainian refugees, and he talked to the Polish government. And I remember I was in Poland, I was in Warsaw right before Biden's trip, a couple of days before, and the atmosphere was electric. And I think Biden, who's a politician, means he's pretty good at understanding the atmosphere. It made it real for him, and you could see the American position hardening and our military effort to help Ukraine increasing after that point. That's a pretty big deal. I don't know whether the Ukrainians can succeed, but they might. They have a reasonable chance of success, which is pretty astonishing. Russia doesn't seem to have the forces, it certainly doesn't have the forces to conquer all of Ukraine, it never did. They failed to take Kyiv, they failed to attack Kharkiv. They're now struggling to make progress in eastern Donbass. They're still making some. They could succeed. They could grind down the Ukrainians. This could work. They could threaten massive famine in the world, which it seems what they're doing. They could hit the Ukrainian economy. That's their best case. But there's the Ukrainian best case. The Russian military offensive is running out of steam. They keep shrinking their ambitions. All of Ukraine, then all of Novorossiya, now just a piece of the Donbass. Russian morale among its troops is reportedly very bad. Ukrainian morale is high. The Western weapons are arriving. I don't know what's going to happen.
But do you believe, well, in terms of the behavior of President Biden's administration, is it also because of the fact that a lot of members of President Biden's administration were also in the administration of President Barack Obama?
Yeah.
And they, well, simply saying, they made a mistake more than 10 years ago in terms of the reset politics towards Russia.
Well, okay, so Obama's famous reset. It didn't work out. And they realized it didn't work out. Michael McFaul, a renowned scholar at Stanford of Russian affairs, was the intellectual architect and the policy architect of the reset. Then he was ambassador to Russia. And if you follow Michael McFaul on Twitter, he's now an Uber hawk pushing for assistance to Ukraine. I talked to him. Okay, Mike McFaul and I are friends, and at the end of the Bush administration, you remember there was the Russo-Georgian War in August '08, and then Obama wins, and they're coming in, and Mike McFaul and I was still assistant secretary, held over into the first 4 months of the Obama administration. And I traveled with McFaul, and we're friends, and he told me about what he was planning to do with the reset. And I said, look, I understand why you're doing this, and I wish you luck. But you're going to fail for the same reasons that we failed. Because Bush tried to reach out to Putin as well, and the reason you're going to fail is that Putin's conditions for good relations with the West are that we give him a free hand for oppression at home and aggression abroad against his neighbors. And you won't do it any more than we did. But go ahead.
And how did he react?
Well, in his memoirs, in his book, he cites that conversation and said I turned out to be right.
So he was polite.
Oh, he didn't argue with me. I mean, he understood I might be right. And I said, I won't attack you. I'm not going to criticize you or say you're soft or naive. I'm not going to do that. And maybe I'm wrong and maybe you'll succeed.
That's how diplomacy works.
Well, look, this is not, it's not like being an academic where your job is to argue. Like,
sometimes.
Look, Mike McFaul was wrong, but it was honest. That is, after 2014, the Obama administration changed its policy. Now, they were wrong not to give weapons to Ukraine. They were wrong about that. I lost on that, but what could I do? I was the sanctions coordinator, and I managed to get the Obama administration gave me the latitude I needed to go out and negotiate the sanctions, so okay. But remember that Obama decided he led NATO to put battalions in Poland and each of the Baltic states, and then he added by putting a U.S. armored brigade into Poland on a rotational basis. Now that's a big deal, but Obama didn't have to do that, but he agreed to it. You know, his administration came up with that, they did it, that was a big deal. That's basically Obama's way of saying, well, I screwed up the reset. The Biden administration has gone much farther. What they're doing is much farther than the Obama people ever dreamt of going. And our relations with Russia are just about rock bottom at this point. And that's a result of Putin. Now, there are people in the West, in the United States, who say, wait, we have to negotiate with the Russians, we have to push the Ukrainians to give up territory, it's too dangerous to have confrontation with Russia, we need the Russians for this or that. Now, I think they're just wrong. Mm-hmm. But
okay, but let me quote Henry Kissinger. A few days ago, he told the audience that he warned that in the long run, what's happening right now in Ukraine, would have disastrous consequences for the stability of Europe. He also suggested that Ukraine should be ready to cede some territory to Russia. And how these words work with solidarity we are talking about.
Ivan Krastev, the great Bulgarian sociologist and a very wise man, said that you could divide opinion in the West into two groups: the party of peace, meaning peace at any price, and the party of justice. Henry Kissinger is speaking as someone from the party of peace. I mean, we're all for peace, but not at any price. The trouble with Kissinger's argument is giving up land will not bring peace. What happened after 2014? There were the Minsk Accords. There was a line of contact, and Putin merely used that time to regroup and launch another attack. Why would this be different? Moreover, there's a moral problem. We know what Russia does in the territories it occupies. It's like what they did in Poland and the Baltic states. The Baltic states in 1940, mass deportations, repression. They will either kill, imprison, or exile all Ukrainian activists, teachers, politicians, civic activists, high school teachers, professors. They are waging a war of national extermination, not genocide against all the people, but destruction of the culture. Putin said so. That's what they're doing. So you want the Ukrainians to give up territory, you better be ready to own up to the consequences. That's not like Denmark losing Schleswig-Holstein to the Germans in the mid-19th century. This is serious stuff. Kissinger ought to know better, for God's sakes. Now, I am not happy with that business. Now, having said that, the Ukrainians may have to give up territory in the end, right? Because of the battlefield. That may be what they have to do. But we should not be in any hurry to push them, especially since Putin hasn't conquered that territory yet. Well, why is it realistic to give the Russians territory that they haven't won on the battlefield? Is it in our interest to give Putin the fruits of conquest of a war he has yet to win? I mean, what the hell? Right now, our strategy should be to help the Ukrainians do the best they can and regain as much territory as they can. Zelensky has never ruled out negotiations, and in fact, in the early days, the early weeks of the war, there were negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians treated it seriously. They were willing to make concessions. They said so. They probably said too much. But the idea that we have to push the Ukrainians into being more flexible ignores the reality that they were flexible. The Russians were not serious. The Russians were not serious. So don't come to me and tell me that the Ukrainians have to be serious or we have to pressure the Ukrainians to be serious. They were serious. Maybe even too public in their willingness to make concessions.
And considering the help to Ukraine, there are doubts worldwide if we should help or how we should help and so on. Is it because of the ongoing or coming energy or food crisis in the world?
Well, Putin's war has created a food crisis. His blockade of Ukrainian grain in the Black Sea ports is a major problem. There are, I'm not an expert in these issues. I don't know what the options are to alleviate this. Putin is using hunger as a weapon. I don't think that giving in to Putin is the right course of action. We need to see whether we can increase the pressure on Putin to let the grain flow. But it seems there will be problems with production in Ukraine, certainly. I don't see how they can harvest anything like their normal harvests. I don't know enough about elasticity of supply of food to know, how much extra American farmers can produce, Canadian, other farmers, if the price goes up. I just don't know that. But consider this. Putin starts a war against Ukraine, and he now escalates and is threatening world hunger. As President Biden said in his speech in Warsaw, for God's sakes, how can this man remain in power? A statement for which Biden was criticized, but I stand by it. That was a little bit like Ronald Reagan's comment that the Soviet Union is an evil empire.
How can he remain in power? Well, there are a lot of people who say the next president of Russia will not be better than Putin.
Well, I'm old. I remember the early 1970s when in Moscow, I was a student in Moscow in 1973. And I remember the view was, after Brezhnev, it'll be worse, so you better get on with Brezhnev. Well, no, after Brezhnev, you had Andropov and Chernenko, the interregnum, but then you had Gorbachev. Why should we assume that after Putin it's worse? And what does that mean, worse? Well, what does that mean?
Well, for example, starting nuclear war.
Well,
Yeah, well, it was very interesting. The French can be awfully tough. And
French.
the French.
Okay.
So after Putin started threatening nuclear war, I think it was the French chief of the general staff said, yes, the Russians have nuclear weapons, and so does France. Our nuclear weapons work. And I thought, all right, the French know how to be damn tough, okay?
You know what I'm talking about.
Sure, I know, but the Russians have nuclear weapons, and so do we.
We as NATO.
The United States, Britain, France. It's the kind of conversation you have not in public with the Russians. You tell Putin's, I imagine there are various back channels, and you tell the Russians, this is not going to work. We're not frightened.
And Mr. Ambassador, so what's next? You said we don't know whether Ukrainians or Russians will succeed. Yeah.
Right.
But how do you see Russia, let's call it, in the new world order? Because the geopolitics changes. That's without doubt.
Look, Russia's in serious trouble. Look what Putin has done. Europe is going to reduce its dependence on Russian energy. The financial sanctions are going to deprive Russia of the ability of getting of new investment capital. The technology sanctions are already having an impact. Now, some of the sanctions the Americans imposed that didn't get noticed are a ban on all semiconductors, chips to Russia. Chips not just from the US, but chips from anywhere in the world that use American technology or licensing, and that's just about all chips anywhere. And you know what happened? The Russians are having trouble in production of automobiles and tanks. They're in a war, and they are having trouble with tank production. That strikes me as a pretty bad place to be. Their economy is not coming back. It's hit. Yes, the ruble is high because the Russians have made the ruble less convertible and they've propped it up. I think the Russian economy is going to be hit. Now, we need to move on the oil, on reducing their income from oil sales. Okay? But in the longer term, Russia's in deep trouble. You think the economy is going to modernize with Putin's kleptocracy? Are you kidding? There's no way. The Russians are going to be more dependent on China. Do you think the Chinese are sentimental about the Russians? I doubt it. Russia's in deep trouble. And a defeat on the battlefield would put Putin in a very nasty position. Now, there's also the issue of whether Putin is sick. Okay? I don't know. But he sure doesn't look well. He's my age. Okay, an old guy. But he doesn't look old, he looks sick. Putin is a guy who believes in his macho image, you know, going bare-chested, and you play, you know, these fake hockey tournaments where he scores goals. I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous. But he was at an outdoor event and he has a blanket that was put there by his staff. That's not macho. Why does he need this? I realize we don't know. But I can imagine a situation in which Putin's war fails and his health seems to fail, and you get a different Russian leadership. Now, I mentioned, you know, Gorbachev, but there's another model, because Stalin dies March 1953. And right then, the Korean War was still in a hot phase, but in a few months, the new Soviet leadership, not exactly liberals, I mean Malenkov, Beria, Khrushchev, they support a ceasefire in Korea. They start lowering the temperature with the United States. These are not liberals. These are not, you know, Khrushchev was the best of the lot. The others were Stalinists. But they wanted less confrontation with the US. That occurred to me. You know, it may be that a new Russian leadership wants a settlement. But if that's the case, then our job in the West is to keep the pressure on. You know, just jam them. And, you know, you mentioned the Biden team. Look, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and I worked together in the Clinton administration for NATO enlargement. He was for it, like, strongly. Toria Nuland is the #3 in the State Department. Well, the Russians hate her just about as much as they hate me. She was a hawk. Celeste Wallander is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security. She's in charge of the operation to send arms to Ukraine. She was one of the supporters in the Obama NSC for heavy sanctions and even weapons to Ukraine. The people who were softer in the Obama administration are not in the government at all. So it's a stronger, tougher team. And, you know, Dalip Singh, you haven't heard of him. He's the Deputy National Security Advisor for Economics. He used to travel with me on my sanctions team to Europe. He's the guy who organized the freezing of $300 billion of Russian foreign exchange reserves by the G7, which was done over a weekend in about 36 hours. That was really cool. I really liked that, because that wasn't on the list, and all of a sudden it was done. These are the people in the Biden administration. They're not exactly sentimental about the Russians, and they are aware that after 2014, we didn't do enough.
So you mentioned China.
Yep.
When China will invade Taiwan? Don't get me wrong, I'm not willing to do that.
Well, you notice that President Biden, I think yesterday or the day before, said the United States will come to Taiwan's defense.
That's why I'm talking about that.
Yeah, well, a lot of people in Washington said, what? What is he saying? He must have misspoken. If you follow Joe Biden's career, you will realize that he does this a lot. He says something which is not quite policy, and it looks like he misspoke, but he usually means it. I've noticed this consistent pattern on many issues where he jams the rest of the US government. He jams it. And he's doing it as president, which is pretty interesting, jamming his own administration, pushing his own administration. It's an interesting tactic, but it's consistent. Joe Biden's been doing this for years. And I'll tell you a story. In 2008, after the Russo-Georgian War, the Georgian economy was a mess, you can imagine. Biden is running for vice president against John McCain, but it's really against the Bush administration. I'm in the Bush administration, and Joe Biden, during the middle of a presidential campaign, publicly says, you know, we ought to give the Georgians $1 billion to support their economy. And in the Bush administration, we heard that and said, what? Biden proposes this? That became a policy because we knew that once Biden, a Democrat, had proposed it, the Obama people and therefore the Democrats couldn't oppose it. So Biden's policy became the Bush administration's policy. We got the $1 billion. We managed to organize about $4.5 billion in a conference, and we saved the Georgian economy. Biden was jamming Obama's own team. They didn't want to do this. Biden didn't care, and I thought to myself, oh, that is really cool. It sounded like an off-the-cuff improv, you know, like just a remark. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was jamming policy through. He's doing it this time. You know, he's got all of this enormous U.S. foreign policy apparatus with a particular position. And he looks at it and he just says, now I'm the president, I'm going to push this. Biden does this a lot. People say, oh, it's just Biden, he shoots his mouth off. I think he knows what he's doing.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for the conversation. And now a Q&A session. So if there are, and I'm more than sure there are, some questions, raise your hand and we will come to you.
Proszę bardzo, szukam ochotników.
My name is Małgorzata Zacharasza-Mańska. I'm of Institute of American Studies. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your insightful comments. And in order to make the picture complete, I would like to hear from you about India as well. So,
About the
India. Because they met, I mean, Biden and Modi last couple of days ago, and the outcomes of the meeting seems promising in terms of Ukraine and India's reluctance to condemn Russia. What do they think? What was on the table? What did they offer Modi to be softer on Russia?
I'm not an India expert. I can't answer your question with the degree of insight that it deserves. I do know that the Biden administration and all the administrations, even the Trump administration, dating back to George W. Bush, have been reaching out to India with some success, not complete, but some success. On his trip to Asia, Biden managed to sign a kind of framework economic agreement, bringing in the Indians and not the Chinese. That's probably a good thing. I wish the Indian position were stronger. It might develop in a good direction, especially if they see that the Russians are threatening mass global famine for the sake of their war. But I think working carefully over years to develop relations with India is probably a good investment. I can't give you a better sense of Indian thinking. I just don't know it. You know, I'm not the expert. But I think the Biden approach is trying to be patient, careful, incremental, building and building and building and building. There's a reasonable chance of success if you don't expect too much. And remember, during the Cold War, we never had India, you know, fully with us. Never. But we did okay anyway, right?
Okay, there's another question. Hello, my name is Roman. I'm a student of international relations at Vilnius University. I have a question. Is it in U.S. policy interest and in West countries' interest to create from Ukraine like a buffer zone between Russia and West countries? Could it be a solution for transatlantic security on the eastern flank? Thank you.
Well, I'm not a real big fan of buffer zones. The Ukrainians at an earlier stage of the war made a public offer that they could stand down from attempts to join NATO in return for security guarantees. So that option is possible. The trouble is, I mean, and some people, and somebody like Henry Kissinger might recall the Austrian State Treaty of 1955. It made Austria neutral but free, and Russia and Soviet troops withdrew. The trouble with Ukraine as a so-called buffer state is that Putin has claimed Ukraine as his. He denies that Ukraine exists as a country. He has staked out an extreme position. So, if the United States made a proposal that Ukraine become a buffer state of some kind, the Ukrainian answer would probably be something like, so you're waiting for the Russians to regroup and try to conquer us again, are you? You see the problem. It is not a stable, lasting solution for Ukraine to be in a gray zone of insecurity, because history suggests the Russians will just turn around and attack it at their next opportunity. And I remember this debate playing out in the early 1990s with respect to Poland, where most of the US foreign policy establishment hated the idea of NATO enlargement, and they thought, well, let's just keep Poland as a buffer state. And the American government wisely, in the end, rejected that course because the more they thought about the consequences, the less they liked it. I was part of that debate. So Ukraine as a buffer zone sounds good to a particular type of foreign policy intellectual for whom it is an abstraction, who has no idea of the real dynamics in this part of the world. Ukraine as a buffer zone has an appeal for people who think that Russia counts and Germany counts, but the countries in between don't count at all. And I've lived much of my professional career dealing with people of that strategic mindset, and I don't think it gives us particularly good results. So, no, I don't think so.
Are there any other questions? Okay, maybe over here at first.
Thank you so much. Gaia Nikini, I'm an Erasmus student here. I was wondering, do you ever think there's going to be such a turning point that either the United States or the whole of NATO will actively intervene in the conflict, or do you think they're just gonna let Ukraine keep going endlessly until they either burn out and conquered by the Russian, or they just have to give up their territory? Or do you think there's ever gonna be a strategy similar to what happened with Gaddafi in 2011, where Americans and NATO tried just to kill off Putin directly?
Yeah.
Thank you.
President Biden has drawn a pretty hard line saying Americans won't intervene in Ukraine militarily. We won't send troops, we won't send planes. He said so convincingly, repeatedly, and I tend to believe him. He has also been pretty clear that we're going to send a lot of weapons to Ukraine. That's where he's drawn the line. I think he's going to keep it that way. Now, I think you could make a pretty good case that Ukraine should be allowed to join NATO. And if you want to read an argument, read Ivo Dalder's article about that. And the reason I mention Ivo Dalder is because he was Obama's first ambassador to NATO. So he's Democratic Party foreign, he's part of the Obama team. And if he's come out with this opinion, then it will affect others. But for now, I don't think we're going to go in. Now, there was a debate. I mean, there were some people, myself included, who said we ought to think about various forms of a no-fly zone, and I can imagine circumstances under which the Biden administration might change its mind, but I doubt it. The Ukrainian position is, we don't need your troops, we need your weapons. So, okay. The Ukrainians really do need our weapons, and we're providing them. So that's where things stand for the moment. I never say never, but I think that Biden has been pretty clear.
There's one question over here. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. My name is Polina. I'm a national security student, and I wanted to ask you about the third country that is currently in this conflict, because for weeks Russians who support war are becoming more and more unhappy with the fact that Lukashenko has now sent his own troops to Ukraine, and also for some days in Russian media there are rumors that losing Ukraine, Putin will want to peacefully make Belarus part of Russia. So what is your opinion on the policy of Putin towards Lukashenko? Thank you.
So Lukashenko he wants to be the dictator of Belarus. He doesn't want to be the Rossiyski namestnik in Belarus. He's shrewd. I don't like him very much, but he's shrewd. Franco in Spain was an enthusiastic fascist, but he never quite got around to joining Hitler's war, infuriating Hitler. It doesn't mean that Franco was a good guy. He wasn't. But he stayed out of the war, mostly. They sent a division to the east, with the Germans on the Eastern Front. The war doesn't seem to be popular among Belarusian society. The Belarusian opposition is pretty well organized. They're a little bit like Solidarity after martial law. I mean, not quite, because Tikhanovskaya is abroad, their leadership is abroad rather than in prison, so the parallel isn't exact, but it's a little bit like Polish Solidarity. And they have their structures. I mean, I met with Tikhanovskaya about 3 weeks ago in Washington. So I know her and I know her people. The war's not popular. There are these reports of the Belarusian railways just not working right. Lukashenko's, sending in your army and having it shot up is one way to alienate your army and maybe get overthrown. Putin doesn't want to lose Belarus, and he's got a problem. if Putin loses his war, the Belarusian opposition is going to take heart. That we in the West should not assume that Belarus is lost. Things could change. Our objective is not NATO membership for Belarus. That's up to them, and there doesn't seem to be a consensus there for it, and we should not push them or raise the issue. The issue in Belarus is democracy, and that's what we should support. And other things can follow. And it's quite interesting to me that Belarusian sort of national identity is crystallizing in a democratic form, as in Ukraine. It took them a while, right? In the 90s, they didn't know. They didn't know what they wanted to be. But the Belarusians, like the Ukrainians, look at Poland, right? In 1989, the standard of living was about the same in all three countries. Now Poland's standard of living is what, 4 times higher? At least? If you're a Ukrainian, you're a Belarusian, you come to Poland, you say, by God, this is what we want. How do we get this? That's a pretty powerful dynamic because it doesn't depend on politicians' speeches. People know it. They see it with their own eyes. I mean, I remember that Poles used to go to Germany, you know, in the 1970s and 80s, and they thought, why do we have to live like this when the Germans get to live like that? That was pretty powerful stuff. They knew that communism had failed because they could see it every day. You know, everybody who went to the West, well, the Belarusians and the Ukrainians know it because they come to Poland or they come to Lithuania. Look, Polish politics, you know, you can argue about, you know, the pluses and minuses and the rozdziały, podziały i tak dalej. But it's a massive success. If you're a Ukrainian, you know, what do you care? Platforma, PiS, Hołownia, what do you care? You just want to be, you want Poland. You want, what did they do to make it so successful? That's powerful, and it's the same for the Belarusians. Right? So this is powerful stuff. We should not rule out the power of democracy combined with national patriotism. Don't rule it out. It has a way of coming back. Putin has the guns. Well, you know, so did the communists, you know, the PRL government in Poland. In 1989, they had all the guns. You see where I'm headed with this. Right.
As far as I see, we still have time for a few questions, okay?
Good morning, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Gabriela. I'm a student of International Relations and Political Studies. I have a lot of questions, but I had to choose the most important ones. And basically, I have 2 questions. The first one is about the future relations with Russia. Can you imagine normalization of our relations with Putin's government after the war in Ukraine? How can it look like in the future? Or do you think it's necessary to change the government completely in Russia, as President Biden mentioned, how for the God's sake Putin can remain in power? And the second question is about the Polish image from the American perspective. How this image has changed? Does it change in any way in connection with this situation? Because right now we have an image of being hosts of millions of Ukrainian people being creating a logistical background for the Ukrainian army, but how do we look like right now from the American perspective? Thank you very much.
Okay, first question. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine normal relations with Putin after these atrocities. Okay. I can imagine some efforts to, in the wake of a settlement of the Ukraine war, if we ever get there, we will want to be able to have a decent dialogue with Russia about some things like security issues. But as long as Putin is in power, relations will be chilly and hostile. We can still talk to them, but let's not exaggerate our hopes. With respect to Poland, its image has just grown and improved enormously. American television showed repeatedly, over and over again, stories of how the Ukrainian refugees had been welcomed in Poland. And the image of Poland is just, like enormously high. A year ago, there wasn't a lot about Poland in the American media, and the stuff about Poland was mainly concentrating on the domestic politics. The government, the fights with the EU, there was some stuff about Lex TVN, the judiciary, it was all of that kind of stuff, and it was pretty negative. And there was kind of a sense that Poland was just like Hungary, which was never true, but Americans without a lot of knowledge tended to lump them together. Now that changed. It changed for several reasons. It changed because President Duda vetoed Lex TVN. That made a big difference. And he did so, he expressed his opposition to Lex TVN in the summer, before Putin's threats against Ukraine, which means the people in the Biden administration who followed this understood that this was not instrumental yet. It was actually a principled position. And to the Biden administration, that made a tremendous difference. Because as senior people said to me, it's a lot easier to embrace Poland as our democratic ally fighting Putin now, because of what Duda did. And of course, then the Americans come in and we are really standing with Poland in solidarity, and President Duda helped make that possible. He made that a lot easier. So you have that going on at the official level, where the Biden administration is actually very appreciative of what President Duda did, because it made their job easier of working with Poland. And then you have the American, the average Americans who see that the Poles are welcoming these Ukrainian refugees and bringing them into their homes and standing up to Putin. And it's, we're back to where we were with a U.S.-Polish alliance, except that now it's not, in theory, it's a wartime alliance. I wish it weren't. I wish there weren't a war. But if there's going to be a war, I'm glad that Poland is on this side of the line rather than the wrong side of the line. That's a big deal. That's a big change. And I tell you, the U.S.-Polish official dialogue is huge. I was in Warsaw last week, and it wasn't, who was there? Janet Yellen was there, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Laura Rosenberger, you've never heard of her, but she's the Senior Director of the National Security Council for China. And she was there for strategic talks with Poland about China, which shows you what's going on. You've now got an American-Polish dialogue about top-level strategic issues. And this is a wartime alliance. Biden himself looks at Poland through the prism of solidarity and 1989. and NATO enlargement, which he supported. Remember, Tony Blinken worked for Biden for years and years and years. So Poland in this administration had a lot of good political capital, and then domestic politics and issues like the judiciary and Lex Tafawen were getting in the way, and those, we're in pretty good shape, and now we have to build on it. And, I can tell you also that a lot of the countries in NATO's east would come to me and they said, we need Polish leadership. Poland is the big country in the east. They can talk to the Americans. They've got weight in Europe. And for God's sakes, we hate the fact that they're fighting with the European Union. We need Poland because we have a Russia problem. These are people from Lithuania and Estonia and Romania who used to come to me. Well, right now, Poland has reemerged as the natural leader of the EU and NATO's eastern flank, which to my mind is pretty good because Polish assessments of Russia tend to be pretty accurate. If you talk to the OSW, Ośrodek Studium Wschodnich, or PISM in Warsaw, Polish experts on Russia or Ukraine and Belarus tend to be really good. They have to be, right? They better be. So right now, Polish-US relations are in terrific shape, but it's unfortunate it's because of a war. We need to build on that. We need to build on that. Anyway, I've given you a long answer, but you're asking an important question. Oh yeah, and on energy security, okay? The Poles are able to say to the Germans, yeah. Right? I've known Piotr Naimski since 1992. He worked for years and years and years to reduce Polish energy dependence on Russia. And I know what that's like. You work in public policy for years and years and years, so that on one day, when Russia cuts off the gas supplies, you're able to say, okay, we've got this. Took a lot of years and a lot of work to get to that point. Now, the task is for us to work on alternatives. But that's good public policy. Anyway, long answer, but this is serious business.
One question more, because we are running out of time.
Ambassador Creek, my name is Jason. I'm an international studies student here as well. Also an American, and you probably know a little bit about me from my wife in your classes. I've got a question related to what the outcome is. So Ukraine's looking really good on all the levels, militarily, mostly because their people are amazing. Also, they're being supplied by the world powers. That continues, and we assume that Ukraine pushes Russia completely from their territory. It looks likely. Do you believe that NATO membership then is their first priority? And if so, how quickly does not only NATO membership happen, but NATO presence in Ukraine occur?
Well, I hope you're right. I don't know that you're right. I don't know that the Ukrainians will push out the Russians. I would say that there is a reasonable chance that they could do so, which is worth investing in. So I'm all for it. But I don't know that, if you talk to senior Americans who are following this, they just don't know. Uniformed military, in Warsaw, I was talking to one of the U.S. generals that was there for a conference, and, they're very cautious. And they're right to be cautious. They don't know. But it's a reasonable prospect. It's not crazy. They could do it. Under conditions of victory, there would have to be a serious discussion of this option. on the grounds, you know, do we Americans, we Europeans want to be back here in another 5 or 6 years? Like, strategic ambiguity and Ukraine outside of NATO didn't work out so well. Look, we've had wars, so you could make the case. I don't know that we'll get there, okay? I was at the Bucharest NATO summit in April 2008 where George W. Bush tried to push the French and Germans into accepting a membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia, and we failed. And a few months later, Putin invades Georgia. I don't want to go through that again. So if that doesn't work out, what's the alternative? What kind of better security arrangements can we work out with the Ukrainians so Putin or whatever, you know, Patrushev, some awful Russian tyrant in the future doesn't try it again? I don't have an answer for that. But, you know, NATO is one answer. Another answer is to arm Ukraine so it's a damn porcupine. I mean, it's just too hard. You know, the Russians just, it's not worth it. But, you know, keep pushing that option, because we shouldn't simply sit on our assumption of no NATO membership for Ukraine. Like, I'm old enough to remember when we thought the Iron Curtain would last forever, that Yalta Europe was permanent Europe, that history was closed for Poland. Too bad. We're very sorry. Biedna dzielna Polska. But too late. Well, that turned out not to be the case. Poland's in NATO. That was supposed to be impossible. And what was really impossible was the Baltic states in NATO. I mean, that was so radical that during the Clinton administration, I didn't even try to get that through, because it would have, I didn't want to put at risk Poland into NATO. So I saved that, and I did that in the, you know, I worked on that in the Bush administration, and President George W. Bush was the one who made the decision to go for NATO membership for the Baltic states. That was him. It went from impossible to inevitable. That's what Condi Rice used to say. She said things are impossible and then they become inevitable. So keep pushing, right? You don't know. You don't know. And the Ukrainians, like, they've shown their toughness. And if they manage to push the Russians out, they need to transform their country, not just rebuild it, not let the oligarchs back. They need to study what Poland did and do a lot of that. And that'll help their NATO membership. All right.
Maciej, floor is yours, but before that, make some noise. Huge applause for Ambassador Daniel.
To all of you. I think that was a great conversation, so let's just have both our guests with a round of applause as well, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Nie, ale wiesz, teraz jest... Tak, wiesz, tak.